Today, we're going to do some gymnastics exercises in space. We'll make an A310 pitch-up and dive down before starting a session of eternal free fall in a box. Unlike astronauts on the International Space Station, since I was born, there hasn't been a single moment when I haven't had weight. My body has always been resting against something, as if pulled downward. My butt on a chair, my back on a bed, my feet on the ground. There hasn't been a single moment when I haven't pressed against something, but for the first time in my life, I'm about to stop feeling it. In a split second, the ground quietly slips away from under my feet, and just like that, my weight has completely disappeared. It was there for decades, and suddenly, it's gone. As if I were in space, in orbit, around the Earth, and my thoughts, just like my body, are then propelled into a strange new world. In that world, starting a movement means keeping it going until something stops it. A world where the ideas of up and down no longer make sense, until your weight, suddenly, makes itself felt again. As you may have guessed, I participated in the latest CNES zero-gravity research flight campaign. These parabolic flights, during which scientific experiments are carried out in weightlessness, without having to go into space. And to understand how something this strange is possible, we need to take a step back and look at the dizzying trajectory of the A310 we're flying in. When I talk about dizziness here, I choose my words carefully. Because to put us in a state of weightlessness, the plane has to go from about 6,000 meters of altitude to 7,500 in just about 20 seconds, and its inclination has to reach 50 degrees. During this climbing phase, inside the fuselage, both bodies and objects are subjected to hypergravity, tilted with respect to the horizon, just like the plane as it pulls up. They feel as if they're crushed by their own weight, which is almost doubled. And during that moment, inside, everyone keeps a low profile, focuses on staying resilient, and waits for that powerful force trying to pin you to the ground to disappear. The cheeks sag, the ribcage feels compressed, and the heart, forced to work twice as hard to pump blood to the head, tightens. This discomfort, this strange feeling of heaviness, is the price to pay. Until finally, after 20 seconds of hypergravity, and once the plane reaches the desired angle and speed, a brief moment of absolute weightlessness opens almost instantly. The release, the weightlessness. And as you may have guessed, in reality, this apparent levitation is just an illusion whose magic lasts only 22 short seconds before we feel our weight again, and the pilots repeat the maneuver that allows us to access this strange state. So, to find yourself in this state without having to go into space, all it takes is an ingenious sleight of hand, which consists of, in a way, temporarily hiding the effects of gravity. And to do this, to be able to offer us these successive moments of existence, momentarily free from weight, the pilots have to keep the plane precisely on a carefully designed parabolic flight path, accelerating toward the ground, at the same speed as an object would in free fall in a vacuum. And that's why, during this phase, you no longer feel your own weight, even though in reality, we're all falling. And to add a bit more dizziness to this maneuver, which I filmed here from the window, you can see during a parabola the impressive tilt of the plane's wings compared to the horizon. You should know that, somewhat counterintuitively, the weightlessness phase is distributed symmetrically on both sides of the parabola's trajectory. It begins right after the hypergravity phase, while the decelerating plane is still climbing, and continues once it starts descending, almost in a dive while accelerating. I'll let you meditate on that and levitate above it. This type of maneuver, which is difficult to perform, requires the three pilots in control of the plane to have specific training, and above all, to focus only on one component during the parabolic phase. The first one handles only the roll, the second one takes care of the pitch and yaw, while the third is just in charge of the thrust and sometimes deals with the alarms that tend to go off. It's a bit like the onboard computer is trying to tell them, okay, this flight path is possible, but maybe you shouldn't be doing this. And it doesn't add anything to the story, but just so you know, Pesquet was at the controls of the plane. In any case, I personally find it a bit crazy and also reassuring to think that, in reality, the plane we flew on is no different from the A310 planes used for regular flights. Of course, these aren't flight paths we're supposed to perform, but the aircraft can handle them. By the way, it's not necessary to get on such a plane, partly piloted by an astronaut, to recreate this phenomenon of weightlessness. This can also be easily reproduced on Earth, on a smaller scale and for a much shorter time. All you have to do is take a box, put some things in it and throw it into the air. If you manage to give it a nice bell-shaped trajectory, then everything inside should go through a brief state of weightlessness, as I'm trying, though struggling, to show with an onboard camera, filming in slow motion to capture the shortness of the phenomenon. Here, the main difficulty is that your box must remain as stable as possible during your throws and not spin, and that's easier said than done. Actually, to make the items inside the box levitate for a longer time, you would need to be able to throw it higher and faster. Make it follow a longer parabola, like the one described by the plane, or ideally, have it match that path. A trajectory that never returns to the ground, meaning putting it into orbit, like the International Space Station, where astronauts are continuously falling. So, if in the ISS everything seems to float, it's because at the altitude of 408 kilometers where the station is located, the Earth's gravitational pull that attracts it and its speed of 28,000 km/h, which tends to move it away from our world, balance each other and allow it to follow. A trajectory on which it is, in a way, constantly falling sideways, without ever reaching the ground. And it's this constant, frictionless freefall that allows astronauts to live in weightlessness. From that point of view, it's amazing to think that if you were instantly teleported into a large, closed, windowless box and you found yourself floating in weightlessness, it would be absolutely impossible for you to say whether this box is falling in orbit around the Earth or floating in deep space, far from any field. This strangeness is one of the predictions of general relativity. And it tells us that, in terms of sensation, there is no difference between being in free fall and not feeling your own weight, and being far from any gravitational field. And even though we know perfectly well that in the absence of air resistance to slow them down, all objects, regardless of their mass, fall at the same speed, it remains a very strange experience to witness this phenomenon firsthand. There is nothing new about that. Galileo had already intuited this more than 3 centuries ago. In 1971, Apollo 15 astronauts even had fun demonstrating this on the moon using a hammer and a feather, which, when dropped at the same time, hit the lunar surface at the same moment.
Mr. Galileo was correct.
And yet, even though we know it, it still remains extraordinarily counterintuitive and fascinating to watch. I'd like to point out that even though we often talk about zero-G flight or zero-gravity conditions, that's actually a misuse of language. There's no such thing as falling without gravity. Gravity itself, whether in the box, the plane, or the ISS, hasn't disappeared at all. We just no longer feel its effects. In this environment, absolute lightness has replaced the burden of weight for a while that can last microseconds, seconds, or even what can feel like eternities. Since, for those who are in orbit on the ISS, weightlessness never stops. The station is continuously falling, along with everything it contains, both equipment and people, carried with it in an endless fall that silences the very notion of having weight. And that's a point that needs to be emphasized. We need to stress it. Because during these phases of weightlessness, even though we no longer feel Earth's gravity, it still exists nonetheless. It hasn't disappeared. It's just masked, and that's true in the plane just like on the ISS. As strange as it may seem, at the altitude of 408 kilometers, where the International Space Station orbits, gravity still has 90% of the value it has on Earth. To put it another way, if you built a 408-kilometer high tower, you could very well stand and hop at the top of it. You would pretty much land back on your feet without really feeling any difference in your weight. At no point at this altitude would you start to levitate. And yet, we all agree that you can do that on the ISS. At the top of the tower, it would look like this. Once again, even though the force of gravity acting on us at ground level is almost the same as the one acting on the astronauts in orbit in the ISS, the latter are actually falling, with an acceleration whose value comes from the gravitational field of our planet. So, is weightlessness the absence of any sensation of gravity, which nothing opposes anymore, and which therefore falls outside our sensory perception? And now, I'd like to ask you a question. Right now, which way up are you? You might be lying down, sitting, maybe standing, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you know it, without a shadow of a doubt. Because the presence of your weight is a constant reminder at every moment, but in weightlessness, no direction in space is imposed on you. There is no longer any preferred direction telling you what you're resting on, no force imposing an orientation on you. Words like up, down, upside down, or right side up become meaningless. And maybe that's the most disorienting thing, this new freedom, the absence of a preferred direction. Thus, astronaut Jean-François Clairvoy, whom you see here explaining the concept of zero-G flights with an astonishing ease, often says that during his stays in space, he always chose, just for the pleasure of the experience, to sleep on the ceiling. A ceiling which, in space, is only a convention based on the way the station is built. the general arrangement of computers and other machines. Obviously, during a zero-G flight, the state of weightlessness is only temporary. Even if the ceiling is only a temporary convention, it's best not to be there when your weight suddenly returns. But in the ISS, weight never comes back to remind you it's there. And that's why orienting the image is coming from there, so that the astronauts appear to us like this rather than like that, is completely arbitrary. Weightlessness has eliminated the concept of vertical for them, altering how they relate to space. Now, reconsider all those improbable images you've seen from inside the space station, in light of the fact that they have no privileged orientation, that it's us, so as not to be unsettled, who assign one to them. Just as we do, by the way, with the planet. And now, maybe you're wondering how we can be sure we've oriented the space station in the right direction if there's no up or down in space. Well, the answer lies in the use of 4 gigantic gyroscopes, which, just like the smaller versions of these objects, always keep the same direction once they're set in motion, as astronaut Tim Peake shows us here. This effect of always maintaining the same plane once set in motion in weightlessness can actually be observed to a lesser extent with a simple fidget spinner. As you can see, I'm struggling to demonstrate it aboard the zero-G flight, and you'll be very happy to know that it's much easier to do when you're in space. Fascinated by the physics of objects in zero-G, and after getting lost in digressions, I forgot to tell you why, fundamentally, we bothered to come and do experiments in weightlessness here on Parabolic flights. When you think about it, these researchers strapped in from all sides and spending 2 hours doing parabolas in rather complicated conditions, packed into their laboratories, firmly anchored to the ground by Earth's gravity alone. Yes, except that it's precisely the fact that parabolas are able to mask the effects of gravity that they came here for. For them, the absence of weight allows them to study phenomena differently. I'm not going to detail the hundreds of experiments that benefit from this effect, but on the single flight I took part in, some were studying the spread of fire, the flow of fluids, or blood coagulation. Others were trying to find the most effective intubation method when you're in space. And I'd like, in conclusion, to come back to that unsettling loss of bearings that hits you when you find yourself for the first time in an environment with no up or down, completely weightless. And it makes you realize that it's definitely a good thing that embarrassment doesn't kill. Because studying this change in how you perceive your posture and movements can have very concrete results. But before we get into that, you'll probably be happy to know that this loss of bearings isn't unique to humans. As the Americans observed during short zero-gravity flight sessions in the 1960s, when they brought cats with them to float, you can see that the cats seem pretty confused. Just like pigeons in zero gravity, who also seem confused and clearly don't know which direction to fly in anymore. For humans, this disorienting confusion can obviously be overcome through experience and repeated training. As demonstrated here with grace by astronaut Alan Bean, who can be seen decades before the existence of the International Space Station, performing graceful gymnastics exercises in zero gravity aboard the short-lived Skylab station. Yet, no matter how well trained they are, astronauts are usually struck by space sickness when they first arrive in orbit. They often feel a bit confused and disoriented, sometimes dizzy with mild nausea, which usually fades after the first 24 hours. Once their brain has gotten used to receiving conflicting information from the eyes and the inner ear. The fluid in the inner ear, which usually allows us to locate our body in space, now floats in all directions without any preferred orientation. In fact, with time and experience, the astronauts' brains learn to ignore and silence this disorientation. The incoherent signals coming from the vestibular system, which is responsible for senses, movement, and balance, so that they practically only rely on visual information to orient themselves. To the point that, as astronaut Tim Peake shows us here, it's possible to spin around like a salad spinner without feeling dizzy at all. And now it's lost. No, it's so fast. Yes, completely normal. Incredible. Understanding how the brain adapts and builds its bearings is one of the major challenges of research, aiming to kill 2 birds with 1 stone in zero gravity. That is, both to improve the daily life and safety of those who go into space, and also of those who stay here on Earth. If I tell you about losing your bearings and balance, difficulty estimating the distance of objects, and trouble coordinating movements, I'm talking a bit about the first days in orbit for astronauts like Thomas Pesquet, but also quite a lot about my grandma. That's why astronauts often serve as guinea pigs for experiments designed by the teams back on Earth, to measure the impact of weightlessness on their fine motor skills and thus collect all sorts of useful data for researchers. In this way, weightlessness helps us better understand phenomena that can be hidden from us by gravity, and as if by contrast, they are revealed by its absence, which, by strongly altering our sensory perception, helps us treat the conditions that can affect us. I'll never go to space, but I did fall at the same time as a flying research laboratory, chutant à la bonne vitesse pour venir comme effacer mon. Wait, a bewildering experience repeated exactly 31 times, totaling 11 minutes and 20 seconds of falling without friction in a state of weightlessness. After 22 seconds of yet another magical interlude, we have to exit the parabola to avoid crashing to the ground. And the harsh reality of our weight hits us hard again. It's been about 60 years since humanity began regularly sending humans into orbit. All in all, fewer than 600 people have crossed the famous Kármán line, the boundary of space located 100 kilometers above sea level. This has allowed us to learn a lot about ourselves and how our bodies behave in weightlessness, but it has also left many unknowns. Because, when combined, the total time spent up there by all astronauts on all space flights adds up to only a century and a half altogether. A huge thank you to CNES and Novspace for their invitation. It was truly mind-blowing. Here it is. Subtitles. Subtitles.